got a scissor movement going in the wrong direction here. It's completely unsustainable. The pension funds have now become net sellers of their own government debt because they have to meet all their obligations to retirees. So who's going to buy the debt? Who's going to buy this stuff? And they're running these vast deficits. I just don't see how it's going to happen. And I'm amazed there hasn't been a crisis. I thought there'd be a crisis a long time ago in Japan. Can they defy gravity for another year or another 2 years? I have no idea when this is going to happen, but this is going to be an absolutely massive crisis when it blows. On China and India, my concern is that they've both got inflation crises. They're overheating. They're in the sort of late phase of the inflation cycle when things start getting nasty. When the more credit you put in the system, you get very little traction out of it. The law of diminishing returns sets in. You get very little extra growth. What you get is a rise in inflation. Prices start going up, and it's politically very, very sensitive in China and India, where food makes up a large part of the inflation index. China's food prices are going up 11-12% a year at the moment. This is getting up towards levels that caused the Tiananmen uprising in '89. It wasn't just a student democracy movement, it was also a major social crisis going on in China, and part of that was the inflation and rising food prices in the late '80s. So the Chinese are very worried about this. They're going to have to deal with it. They're going to have to slam on the brakes.
Do you think it's possible they may apply the U.S. tactic of redefining the rules? In the U.S., they basically have removed food and energy as determining factors in their economic statistics. So now suddenly inflation is not as bad because we're not counting food, we're not counting energy prices. Do you think China might try some tactic of that sort?
Well, there are huge doubts about the quality of Chinese data. A lot of people don't believe, including, as it turns out, the Deputy Prime Minister. The man is going to probably in 2 years be the next leader of China. In one of the WikiLeaks cables, he's quoted saying, well, I don't believe any of our data. He looks at freight rates, electricity use, and I think it's property construction. 3 indicators, and he says, look at that, I know what's actually happening, not what they tell me. So there are a lot of reasons for being a bit worried about Chinese, whether you're really getting the truth. But I don't think on this particular point they would do that, because my sense in China is it's people in the marketplace, it's poorer people, it's migrant workers, many tens of millions of them come over from central and western China, the poorer areas, and they work in the cities of eastern China. But they work in pretty tough conditions, actually, and they're very, very badly paid. What they're experiencing every day, some of the vegetable prices up 20-30%, I don't think they're looking at the data. They're just living their lives. They're getting squeezed very, very badly. I don't think it would help them to try and do that. It would just to manipulate it. The fact is, the prices of these things are rocketing for a strata of Chinese society that's very, very politically volatile anyway. There have been a lot of protests across Chinese cities in the last 2 or 3 years. Most of them don't even get reported. Unless you kind of know a particular town well, you wouldn't even know it had occurred. But it's a constant worry, and the authorities are extremely concerned about it. This is why the Chinese government's going to have to deal with the inflation problems. What they've done so far is they try to slam on food price controls. The usual, you use what's called financial repression rather than getting to the source of the problem. The real problem is they've been running a set of economic policies that has caused them to overheat and lose control. That's the real problem in China. And it's exactly the same in India, where the inflation rate is completely out of control. And furthermore, India has a huge debt, which people don't talk about very much, but about 80-90% of GDP now, probably 80% of GDP. And they're running huge deficits of about 10% of GDP. If you include the regional governments, the central government, and you include all these disguised fuel subsidies they have, which is all part of the deficit, basically, it's the same as America. I mean, the idea that this is a well-run, healthy country and it's the rising BRICS, they're going to take over the world. I mean, as soon as you actually look into these countries in depth, you realize the huge problems each of them have for different reasons. My concern is that India and China are going to have to slam on the brakes at some point this year. If they manage to drag it out into 2012, it'll make it even worse because they need to deal with this immediately, frankly. And then we get a situation where they start slowing quite sharply before the West has recovered. And we would then be in something very like the 1930s because there will be no longer a single pillar of global growth left in the world. And that is my fear.
Do you believe China will ever open the yuan to global markets? I know that's been a big issue. The U.S. has been pushing for that. China has been resisting that. Do you think that we're going to see any changes in that status quo?
They've pretty much said, the central bank, that they want to make the yuan convertible. They want to make it a sort of modern, fully integrated currency, and they're engaged in all kinds of experiments at the moment in Hong Kong. They're using Hong Kong as a kind of laboratory under their control to sort of tiptoe into this. They're not ready yet. The problem is that they're not running an economic policy that's remotely coherent, in my view. They could solve the food price crisis in China in 10 seconds just by letting the exchange rate rise, because quite a lot of their food's imported. But they won't do it. Instead, they're trying to use these other sort of contorted ways of controlling the inflation problems. They should have let the yuan rise ages ago. Instead, what they did is they held it down because they're pursuing a predatory trade policy of conquering market share in the West. But in doing so, it's at the expense of Western competitors. While this is not totally different from what Japan did for a while and Korea did and the others did for a while, it's somewhat more aggressive, and China's simply too big for America and Europe to cope with the consequences of it. So it's not a tenable policy politically. It's going to lead to a backlash. We've already had some quite serious warning signals from Congress. It's not in their own interest in any case, because accumulating vast reserves, $2.6 trillion of reserves, is a destructive policy for China itself. It's not a strength. People think, well, they've got all these reserves, oh, they're on top of the world. Well, they're not. It's not how it works. There are only two other cases in the last century when one power accumulated equivalent of 5 or 6% of global GDP in reserves, and that was the United States in the 1920s, which is the China of its day, and Japan in the 1980s. And both cases ended in disaster. Because when the bubble burst and the trading system sort of fractured, particularly in the 1930s with America, it was the surplus country, which was then America. The country had been accumulating all these reserves because it had an undervalued currency, which America had then under the gold standard, that suffered the most. Because when you get that kind of collapse in the trading system, it's the surplus country that gets killed, not the deficit country. The deficit country in the 1930s was Britain and the British Empire, because we were overvalued on the exchange rate. We were then in the position that America is now vis-a-vis China. And what happened? Well, actually, the British Empire did rather well, relatively speaking, in the 1930s. We avoided the worst of the Depression, and America got slaughtered. America's economy contracted by 26%. This is why I think China's policy is so foolish. In the end, if they provoke a protectionist backlash from the United States and from the West, they're going to be the losers in exactly the way that America was the loser when it provoked a protectionist backlash in 1930 after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Surplus powers are always the most vulnerable.
The U.S. has very specific criteria for what it calls a recession or a depression. And according to official sources, the United States is no longer even in a recession. However, everyone with whom I speak is having major problems making ends meet. It seems like a depression, not just in the U.S., but around much of the world. How would you characterize the economic situations in the United States and the European Union? Recession, depression, or something else?
I think it's a kind of sort of 21st century depression. It's disguised by the much greater depth of wealth that people have, and to some degree by the variance of the welfare and support system that exists even in America. And that cushions the blow to some degree, masks it. And also because of the policy response, they threw everything they had at this crisis. And they managed to slow it down and stop it collapsing too far, but they haven't got out of the basic structural depression. The problem here is there's not enough demand in the global economy. There's too much supply. There's too much production. China and other countries have been investing in massive overinvestment. China's consumption as a share of GDP has actually fallen in the last 12 years from 48% to 36% of GDP. It's actually getting worse, not better. A vast chunk of the economy has gone into investment in plant and machinery in order to ship yet more goods to the world that can't be absorbed. And they're not the only country doing that. It's happening in several parts of the world. So you've got this structural oversupply, and there's not enough demand to absorb it. That is a classic formula for depression. Now you can cushion it, you can dress it up, you can kind of stretch things out. You do it over 10 years instead of having it all in 3 years and with utter havoc. But you don't get out of the problem. You've got sort of suboptimal equilibrium where you're stuck in a kind of liquidity trap. It's when the thing doesn't sort of right itself naturally. I think Irving Fisher, the great American economist, had this expression. It's like a recession is like a ship that sort of goes over in the wind, but then comes back again, the normal action. In a depression, it just tips over just far enough that it doesn't right itself and actually capsizes, and then you can't get it up at all. It doesn't matter what you do, you can't get it up. And that's a very good description, I think, because they've tried. If zero interest rates and quantitative easing haven't really turned this thing around, and if massive indebtment by the government hasn't turned it around, you're wondering, well, what can? We're sort of stuck.
The EU appears on the brink of collapse. Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland all appear poised to crash. Germany and Italy have expressed some desire to return to their respective state currencies. The IMF is willing to help, but only with severe controls attached to its assistance. Will the European Union survive, or will it revert to nation-state status? And are we going to start seeing some of these state currencies resurrected, say in Germany or in Italy?
The creation of the euro is a sort of massive political project and commitment by Europe, and it's not something that's going to be given up lightly. The European Union itself is not something you can really challenge. You'll be dismissed as a fringe politician if you talked about wanting to leave it. It's a part of the furniture at this point of European life. The reason why they launched the euro, basically, it wasn't done for economic purposes. It was done by the European elites in order to accelerate the process of integration towards a kind of European superstate. The insiders in Brussels felt that there would be too much resistance from the member sovereign states to give up a lot of their powers to this central system. If you create a monetary union with this European Central Bank, ultimately it can't work unless you have a fiscal union, you have a budget union, and a debt union, and you create the apparatus of a federal system like the United States. And they knew that, essentially, many of the architects of it. And they suspected that one day the crisis would come and it would just force the EU states to say, we better go to the next stage now and fold our budgets together and create a European treasury and a European finance ministry and move to the next stage of closer integration. So they were kind of banking on this to some degree. Anyway, we're at the moment of truth. Will we now go this way to make it work? They can make it work if they turn Europe into a system model on the United States. But the trouble is, Europe is nothing like the United States. It's made up of historic nations. 8 of them were former empires in their own right. They're very proud, prickly peoples with completely different legal systems, labor bargaining systems, democratic practices, different kinds of parliaments. They have a media in their own language. They don't read each other's media at all, hardly. So you read the Italian press, and it's all about local goings-on in Italy and Rome, and it's completely different from anything you'd read in the German press or in the French press or in the British press. There is no shared political culture. There's no shared demos, so you can't have a democracy. There is no European people as such.
And it seems that some of the member states, most notably Germany, are getting tired of supporting some of these other states. That sounds to me like there is opposition to maintaining the European Union, but you seem to think that there's just no way it's going to come apart.
Well, I'm not going to underestimate the huge political commitment to this thing. Obviously, what's happened with the euro is the South joined before they were ready. The economies had not converged at all with Germany in the North. And Germany actually didn't quite realize what it was getting into either. It thought it could have everything its own way and everybody had to turn into Germans. It was completely unrealistic. It was an absurd assumption. So what's happened in the last 10, 15 years is that the gap has grown wider and wider and wider. And while Germany was screwing down wages and deflating, basically, the South were enjoying a huge boom. And everything was masked by this credit bubble. And then it also blew up. And now we've got a situation where several countries are trapped in debt deflation and sort of spiraling downwards and they can't get out of it. And the EU's coming in with these rescue packages. But these are loans. These aren't genuine bailouts. It's just more debt for countries that are already up to their necks in debt. The last thing they need is more debt. They need to default. That's what they need to do. They need to restructure. They need to clean out a lot of this debt. They need to do what the IMF normally does when it goes into a country. There's got too much debt. It says, right, we have a massive devaluation, so you can export again and claw your way out of this. And we have a debt restructuring to clear part of the burden. And you have a massive fiscal retrenchment, so you slash spending. You do all this together, and it's a package. Part of it's stimulatory, part of it's contractionary. It gets the country out of its mess. What the EU is doing is totally